The box looked ordinary, wrapped neat, tied with ribbon. It was supposed to be a gift from my own son, but inside was enough poison to kill me twice over. I didn't say a word. Not to him, not to anyone. Because sometimes silence is the sharpest blade a man can carry. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 72 years old, a retired history teacher from Indiana. Most of my life, I lived by lessons of patience, timing, and the truth that history always remembers. I've been called steady, careful, a man who writes everything down and forgets nothing. I thought I had peace in my final years, a quiet home, a small pension, and a family that still came by every now and then. But I was wrong. Because sometimes, even the people you raised, the people you trusted most, can turn their back on you. And when they do, you learn what kind of man you really are. Peace has a way of making you forget the storms that might still come. I used to think retirement was a quiet reward. After 40 years teaching high school history, I thought I'd earned it. My mornings had a rhythm. Wake up before the sun, put on a pot of coffee, and step out onto the porch with the newspaper. Indiana mornings can be gentle, with the mist rolling off the fields and the faint smell of wet grass. I liked it that way. Quiet. Predictable. The house I live in isn't grand. Just a modest 2-story, white paint peeling on the edges, the kind of place you drive past without a second thought. But inside, it holds memories. My wife, Carol, passed away 12 years ago. Her picture still sits on the mantel, smiling, hair curled just the way she liked it. I talk to her sometimes, even now, not out loud, just in my head. When you've spent decades with someone, silence carries their voice. I lived simple. Groceries on Fridays, church on Sundays, lawn cut on the first Saturday of every month, whether it needed it or not. I wasn't chasing anything anymore. My life wasn't about climbing ladders or chasing titles. I had enough money in my pension to keep the lights on, food in the fridge, and maybe spoil my grandkids when they visited. That was enough. But peace can be deceptive. It can make you forget that storms don't always come from strangers. Sometimes, they come from your own blood. My son Michael was always a complicated boy. As a child, he had energy I couldn't keep up with. Running through fields, scuffing his knees, coming home with mud on his jeans. I admired his spirit, even if I couldn't always control it. Carol used to say he'd either build something great or burn something down. She wasn't wrong. As he got older, I noticed he had a hunger in him. Not for knowledge, not for discipline, but for shortcuts. While I worked 40 years at the school, Michael bounced from job to job. He tried construction, sales, even running, a small car dealership. Nothing lasted. Nothing satisfied him. And every time he stumbled, he came back to me. "Dad, just a little help. This is the last time." I heard those words more than I care to count. I gave him money, thousands over the years, some from savings, some from what little Carol left behind. Each time I told myself it was for family. That's what fathers do. They help their children get back on their feet. But each time I handed him an envelope of cash, I saw something shift in his eyes. Not gratitude, expectation. Still, I didn't stop. Maybe I was blind. Maybe I didn't want to face the truth. I told myself it was temporary. That one day, he'd turn a corner, steady himself, and stand on his own 2 feet. Fathers like to believe in their sons even when the evidence tells them not to. By the time I turned 72, things had quieted down. Michael didn't come around as much. We spoke on the phone, short conversations. He was always busy, always tired, always struggling with new opportunities. I stopped asking questions. Sometimes silence keeps peace longer than words. So when my birthday rolled around that year, I didn't expect much. Maybe a call, maybe nothing at all. That's the way things had been. But when the doorbell rang, and I saw a package on the step with his handwriting across the top, I felt something stir in me. A flicker of hope. It was wrapped neat, tied with ribbon, heavy in my hands. My son had remembered me. He had thought of me. Maybe things weren't as broken as I believed. Maybe this was his way of reaching back. of repairing what time and distance had eroded. I placed it on the table, ran my fingers across the paper. I didn't open it right away. I wanted to savor the moment, to sit with the idea that maybe my boy had finally remembered who I was, not just a wallet, not just a safety net, but his father. I didn't know then what was inside. I didn't know that the box I cradled in my hands carried something darker than any storm I'd weathered before. All I knew was peace, quiet mornings, steady days, the kind of life that makes you think nothing can touch you anymore. But storms don't announce themselves, they come sudden, sharp, from the people you least expect, and this package and was the first crack in the life I thought was safe. Trust doesn't shatter all at once, it cracks first. I left the package on the kitchen table for most of that day. At 72, I don't rush into much anymore. I like to let things breathe. Let them sit a while before I act. That box was no different. I kept glancing at it the way you look at a picture hanging slightly crooked on the wall. You don't want to touch it, but it draws your eye again and again. By evening, I gave in. The ribbon came off first, neat, precise, as if he had taken real care in wrapping it. That detail alone almost softened me. Maybe this was his way of making peace. I wanted to believe it. Inside, beneath layers of tissue, sat a glass bottle. It looked expensive. Dark amber liquid inside, a golden label I didn't recognize. Whiskey. The kind of drink men bring out to mark occasions. Michael knew I wasn't much of a drinker, but he also knew I respected a good gesture. I ran my hand over the label, the raised lettering. For the first time in years, I felt something warm toward him. Maybe he'd finally thought of me, not just his needs, but then the smell. When I twisted the cap and held it near my nose, something turned my stomach. It wasn't the sweet, smoky smell of whiskey. It was sharp, bitter, chemical. I frowned, tightened the cap again, and set it down. For a while, I told myself, it was just strong, maybe aged differently, but something in me wouldn't let it go. The next morning, I carried the bottle over to my neighbor, Jim. He's a retired chemist, worked 30 years in a lab before settling into gardening and tinkering with machines. Jim knows things, the kind of details ordinary folks overlook. I told him I'd received a gift and wasn't sure what to make of it. He poured a small measure into a glass, swirled it, sniffed it, then set it down slowly. His brow furrowed. "This isn't whiskey, Walter," he said. His voice was careful, measured. "This smells like pesticide." My stomach dropped. I laughed it off at first, said maybe the bottle had been tampered with during shipping. But Jim shook his head. He said he'd bet on it. Strong, industrial pesticide, the kind meant to kill rodents or insects. Enough of it and it could kill a man too. I walked home with the bottle heavy in my hand. My mind felt heavier. My son had sent this, wrapped neat, tied with ribbon, smiling handwriting on the box. A gift meant to celebrate my 72nd year. And inside, death. For hours, I sat at the kitchen table staring at it. Questions ran circles in my head. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe someone else switched the contents. I wanted desperately to believe any of those excuses, but deep down I knew better. Michael had debts. I'd heard it in his voice the last few times we spoke. Short, rushed, edges of panic hiding underneath. He'd asked for money before, he'd drained what I could give, and now, maybe he thought he was done waiting. Inheritance. The word rang in my ears like a bell I couldn't unhear. The thought that my own son, the boy I'd raised, the boy Carol and I loved, had sent me poison, not whiskey. Felt like someone had reached inside and cut out a piece of me, but I didn't cry. I didn't scream. That's not who I am. I sat still, breathing slow, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Calm doesn't mean you aren't breaking inside. It means you control the break. You choose what to do with it. And as I stared at that bottle, I realized trust wasn't something I could give him anymore. It hadn't shattered in one moment. It had been cracking for years, each time he asked, each time he lied, each time I believed. This was just the final crack, the one that brought the whole thing down. But I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't call the police. I didn't call Michael. I did nothing, because sometimes the smartest thing a man can do is stay silent. There are moments that don't just wound you, they change you. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my chair by the window, the bottle sitting on the table across from me like some silent witness. The house was dark, except for the dim glow of the streetlight spilling through the blinds. I could hear the soft hum of cars in the distance, the occasional bark of a dog. Life outside went on as usual, but inside my home, everything had shifted. I kept seeing Michael's face in my mind, not the man he had become, but the boy he used to be. The boy who once held my hand at the county fair, who begged me for another ride on the Ferris wheel. The boy who sat cross-legged on the living room floor, building toy castles with Carol watching, laughing as he knocked them down just to build them again. Those memories, they cut sharper than the betrayal itself. But then the other images forced their way in. The endless phone calls. "Dad, I just need a little more time. Just one more loan." The stories that didn't add up. The sudden anger when I hesitated. The guilt trips. The way he looked at me not as a father anymore, but as a bank. A bank that was supposed to keep on giving until it finally closed. I realized then that he hadn't seen me as his father for a long time. Just an obstacle. And now with that bottle, I understood something colder. He didn't just want my money. He wanted me gone. I picked up the bottle, turned it in my hands. My reflection warped in the glass. A man nearing the end of his life. Lines etched deep in his face, holding in his hand a gift from his only son. A gift meant to erase him from this world. It was almost poetic. Almost. There was a moment sitting there when anger wanted to rise in me. A loud, fiery anger, the kind that makes you grab the phone, dial the number, and shout until your throat burns. But I stopped it. That wasn't me. That wasn't how I'd lived my life, and it sure as hell wasn't how I'd handle this. I thought, back to my years teaching history. I'd told my students again and again, wars aren't always won by the strongest army or the loudest generals. Sometimes they're won by the ones who wait, the ones who move when the time is right, and stay silent when silence is the sharpest weapon. That night I made a choice, not out of anger, not out of fear, out of something deeper. I wouldn't confront him. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. I wouldn't even let him know I knew. From this point forward, every word I spoke to him would be measured, calm, and deliberate. Because I realized something important. Michael thought he had me cornered. He thought I was old, weak, blind. But what he didn't know was that I still had patience. And patience can be more dangerous than poison. The breaking point wasn't the poison itself. It was the moment I decided I'd never give him another chance to hurt me again. The moment I shifted from father to strategist, from protector to avenger. I set the bottle back on the shelf, high, where I could see it but never touch it. It would stay there, a reminder, a symbol of what my son had chosen. Each time I looked at it, I felt something solidify inside me. A resolve I hadn't felt in years. When the sun finally rose the next morning, I brewed my coffee, sat on the porch, and read the paper just like always. To the neighbors, I was the same Walter Briggs, quiet, steady, predictable. But inside, something had changed. My trust was gone. My patience was no longer for him. It was for me, for what I would do when the time was right. And as I sat there, sipping my coffee, I realized the truth. My son thought the story was already over. He thought he'd written the ending, but I was still here. And I was just beginning. Some wars are won by waiting. When you've been betrayed, the instinct is to react, to shout, to demand answers. But I've lived long enough to know that reaction is a gift you hand to the betrayer. It shows your cards. It lets them know what you've seen, what you know, what you plan to do. And me? I wasn't giving my son a single gift he didn't earn. So I stayed silent. I left the bottle right where it was, on the high shelf in the dining room. Not hidden, not thrown away, right in plain sight where I could see it every day. A reminder, a test of patience. Some men carry photographs of their children. I carried a bottle of poison. The next week, Michael called me. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. He asked if I'd opened the gift. I let a pause hang in the air before answering. Yes, I said, calm as stone. It's on the shelf. Haven't had the heart to open it yet. There was a silence on his end. I could hear his breath shift. Well, Dad, he said, forcing a chuckle, you ought to try it. That's good whiskey. I didn't respond right away. Just let the quiet stretch, long enough for him to feel it. Then I said, maybe soon. And I changed the subject. Talked about the weather, the neighbors, the price of groceries. Nothing that mattered. That's the thing about silence. It doesn't just mean saying nothing. It means talking without ever touching the truth. Every conversation after that was the same. He'd circle back to the bottle. Each time I gave him the same answer, calm, vague, dismissive. Not yet. Maybe this weekend. Haven't had company over to share. I could almost feel his nerves rising through the phone. That quiet unease was my weapon. In the meantime, I carried on like nothing had changed. I trimmed the hedges, went to church, shook hands with neighbors at the grocery store. If you'd seen me, you'd think I was just another old man filling his days. But inside I was sharpening something far more dangerous than anger. I was sharpening patience. I started keeping notes, dates, times, details of every call. Every word he said about that bottle went into a notebook I kept tucked in my desk. I didn't write with fire in my veins. I wrote like a historian, calm, factual, permanent, the way I'd taught my students to record the past. Because I knew someday soon, the details would matter, and when they did, I'd have them all. Neighbors noticed Michael stopping by less often. When he did, he asked about the bottle almost immediately. I'd smile slow and steady and say, haven't opened it yet, saving it for something special. His eyes would flicker just for a moment. That flicker told me everything I needed. He was waiting for me to drink it, waiting for me to fall silent in a way I wouldn't recover from. But I had turned the tables. Now he was the one living in silence, my refusal to play the part he'd written for me. Each time he asked and I deflected, the pressure shifted onto him. He couldn't know what I knew. He couldn't know what I planned. That uncertainty was its own kind of poison, one I fed him drop by drop. It wasn't easy. Some nights I sat alone and felt the weight of it pressing down on me. The knowledge that my own son wanted me dead, that kind of truth doesn't sit light. But when the doubt crept in, I looked at that bottle. I remembered Jim's words. This isn't whiskey. And I reminded myself that silence wasn't weakness, it was power. Days turned into weeks. I kept my life steady, unchanged. Michael grew more restless, more persistent. But I stayed calm, patient, silent. Because silence wasn't just my shield. It was a trap. And I knew, sooner or later, he'd step right into it. Every detail mattered now. I've lived long enough to know that patience without direction is just waiting to die. Patience with purpose, though, that's strategy. After weeks of silence, I knew it was time to move. Not to strike. Not yet. But to prepare. The first step was simple. Record everything. I bought myself a little notebook, the kind school children use. On the first page, I wrote the date the package arrived. Then I wrote down what Jim, my neighbor, had told me. Pesticide, not whiskey. I wrote it in his exact words, careful, steady. Every time Michael called, I documented it. His tone, his words, the pauses in his voice when I said I hadn't opened the bottle yet. It wasn't anger I put on those pages. It was evidence, but paper wasn't enough. I knew paper could be torn, lost, or doubted. So I went one step further. I bought a small handheld recorder, nothing fancy. I started recording our phone calls. Each time his voice pushed me toward the bottle, I captured it. Calm, simple, undeniable. The second step was my will. A father doesn't want to think about such things, but I already had a will written years back, leaving most of what I had to Michael and his children. That, I realized, was dangerous. If Michael thought I was worth more dead than alive, he already had a motive. I couldn't erase that motive entirely, but I could shift the ground beneath him. So I went to see my lawyer. A gray-haired man I've known since Carol passed. I didn't mention the poison, I didn't mention suspicion. Instead, I told him I wanted to update my will, make provisions for the grandkids, for a scholarship fund at the high school where I taught, even a small donation to the church. Michael's portion shrank, piece by piece. Not gone entirely, not yet, but smaller, noticeably smaller. I left the lawyer's office with sealed copies and a quiet satisfaction. My son didn't know it yet, but the foundation he thought he stood on was already cracking. The third step was weaving a safety net without anyone realizing. I started spending more time with neighbors. I invited Jim and his wife for coffee. Stopped by another neighbor's house to help fix a fence post. I wasn't loud about it, but I made sure people saw me, noticed me, understood my routine. If something happened to me suddenly, they'd remember. They'd question. And suspicion would point where it belonged. I also told Jim casually that I was keeping the bottle on display. Saving it for a special day, I said with a smile. He didn't press, but I could see the way his eyes flicked toward it whenever he came over. He knew. He remembered. That mattered. The final step was patience itself. I didn't want revenge that screamed. I wanted revenge that whispered so softly it would chill him to the bone. So, I let Michael believe he still had control. Each time he asked about the bottle, I gave the same slow answers. Haven't opened it yet. Thinking about it soon. My voice never changed. My story never slipped. What he didn't know was that every word he spoke was being collected. Every nudge recorded, every crack in his mask written down in neat rows of ink. I wasn't just his father anymore. I was his historian, and history has no mercy for the guilty. There's a moment in chess where the game looks balanced, but one player already knows it's lost. The other just hasn't realized it yet. That's where we were. To him, I was still the old man dragging his feet. To me, he was already trapped. And the beauty of a good trap is this. You don't have to force anyone into it. You just wait. Quiet. Still. Patient. Because sooner or later, the guilty always step into their own downfall. I didn't strike with noise. I struck with patience. Execution doesn't always mean violence. It doesn't mean a man pulls a trigger or throws a punch. Sometimes it means finally letting the truth walk out into the open and making sure it can't walk back in. That was my kind of execution. By the time autumn rolled around, I'd gathered enough silence to weigh a man down. The notebook was full. The recorder held hours of his voice, pressing, urging, circling back again and again to that bottle. I'd filed away every detail like evidence in a trial that hadn't started yet. All that was missing was his reaction. So I gave him the stage. One evening, I invited Michael over. I told him I'd been thinking of opening the bottle at last, maybe sharing it between us. My voice was calm, casual, the kind of voice a tired old man would use when trying to mend fences. He didn't hesitate. He said yes right away, almost too quick. When he walked in, his eyes went straight to the dining room shelf, straight to the bottle. I noticed it, that hunger in his glance, but I didn't say a word. I moved slow, steady, like I always did. I set the bottle down on the table, placed 2 glasses beside it. My hands didn't shake. I poured. A little, in each glass. The liquid looked rich under the dim light, but I could see his shoulders stiffen. He hadn't expected me to actually drink it. His plan had always been distance. Me, alone, found too late. But here I was, setting the glass in front of him, placing one in front of me. I lifted mine, held it steady, and looked him in the eye. To family, I said softly. His throat worked, but no words came. His fingers tapped against the glass, in front of him, restless. He didn't drink. He tried to force a smile, said, "Go ahead, Dad. You first." I let the silence stretch, long, heavy. Then I set my glass back down, untasted. "Maybe later," I said, leaning back in my chair. My voice didn't crack, my eyes didn't blink. I just let the weight of that moment sit between us. He shifted, cleared his throat, made excuses to leave early. Something about work, about needing to get back. He couldn't get out of that house fast enough. And I recorded all of it. His nervous laugh, his refusal to touch the glass, the way he practically bolted once the bottle sat untouched on the table. That night, I took the recorder, the notebook, the bottle, and I laid them all out on the kitchen counter. Evidence, solid, unshakable. Then, for the first time, I picked up the phone. Not to call Michael, not to confront him, but to call the people who would listen, the authorities. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply explained. I told them about the package, about the chemist neighbor who suspected pesticide, about the recordings, the notebook, the night my son refused to touch the glass he insisted I drink. I handed them everything, calm as you please. Let the evidence do what shouting never could. The officers came quietly, asked their questions, took what I had given them. They thanked me for being thorough. "Most men wouldn't think to write it all down," one of them said. I only nodded. History teaches you that details matter more than noise, and I had all the details. From that point on, the silence wasn't mine to carry anymore. It was his. My son, sitting in his home, not knowing the ground was already giving way beneath him, thinking he still held the upper hand, while in reality, his own words, his own gift, his own trap, had already sealed his fate. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I didn't even say goodbye. Because revenge for me wasn't about fury. It was about patience. And patience had just turned into action. Sometimes a man builds his own gallows, one word at a time. Downfall doesn't arrive with thunder. It doesn't shout at the door. It creeps in quietly, the way winter creeps into the bones of an old house. For Michael, it began with a knock he never expected. It was early morning when the investigators paid him a visit. They didn't storm in, didn't rattle the neighbors, they just asked questions, polite, steady, unrelenting. Questions Michael couldn't answer without tripping over his own words. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. I'd already given them what they needed. His voice, his handwriting in my notes, the bottle that no longer looked like a gift but a weapon. My silence had already spoken for me. Michael denied, of course. He tried to twist the story, tried to paint me as paranoid, an old man too suspicious for his own good. But the investigators weren't listening to excuses. They had the recordings. His voice, pushing, pressing, over and over. They had the chemist's report, showing traces of poison in the liquid. They had the photographs of the bottle, the fingerprints on the seal. Evidence doesn't argue. It just waits. And that waiting broke him. Within weeks, the investigation had turned into charges. Attempted poisoning, premeditation, conspiracy. Words no father should ever have to hear tied to his son's name. But I heard them. I sat in the back of that courtroom, silent, steady, as the lawyers laid out what I already knew. Michael's face that day wasn't the face of a son. It was the face of a cornered man. His confidence, the arrogance I'd seen in him for years, crumbled under the weight of his own lies. He tried to look at me, tried to search for pity in my eyes. I gave him none. I had already given him patience. I had already given him silence. Mercy was not mine to give anymore. The jury didn't take long. They didn't need to. The recordings spoke louder than his protests. The bottle told a clearer story than his tears. When the verdict came down, guilty, I didn't flinch. My hands didn't tremble. My face didn't change. I just breathed, slow and steady, like a man who'd carried a heavy load and finally set it down. Some might say I should have felt satisfaction, relief, even triumph. But what I felt was simpler. colder, a quiet confirmation that patience had done its work, that a man doesn't need rage to bring down a traitor. He only needs to wait long enough for the truth to eat through the lies. After the trial, people asked me if I'd visit him, if I'd speak to him, write to him, give him some form of closure. I didn't. Closure belongs to the one who keeps their silence. He had chosen his path, step by step, word by word, until the ground gave way beneath him. And that was the heart of it. His downfall wasn't mine to design. I didn't need to push him. I only needed to let his own choices circle back. The gift he sent me became the chain that bound him. His own tongue became the rope that tightened around his neck. I didn't shout. I didn't curse his name. I didn't stand up in court and make a speech. I sat still with my coffee cooling in my hand, watching the world fold in on the man who once called himself my son. That was enough, because revenge, in its purest form, doesn't roar, it whispers. And whispers, carried on the weight of time, can bring down an empire. Silence isn't weakness. It's a weapon. When the trial was over and the courthouse emptied, I walked home alone. The air was cool, the streets quiet, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Some men think revenge means fire, loud, destructive, violent. They think it means raising your voice until it drowns out everything else. But I learned something different. True revenge doesn't need fire. It needs time. It needs patience. And it needs silence sharp enough to cut deeper than any blade. Michael thought he knew me, thought I was weak, too soft, too trusting. He mistook kindness for blindness and patience for frailty. But he forgot the one truth every man should know, that the quiet ones are the ones who never forget. I had been quiet all my life. Through the long shifts at the factory when bosses barked, orders and younger men thought they knew everything. Through raising a family, paying bills, swallowing disappointment. Through the loss of friends, the long nights alone. The endless waiting for mornings that came too slow. Quiet had always been my nature. He thought that made me easy prey. But silence isn't surrender, it's storage. Every lie, every betrayal, every word he spoke, I stored it. And when the time came, I returned it to him, piece by piece, until the weight broke him. People ask me sometimes if I regret it. If, as a father, I should have turned the other cheek, looked the other way, forgiven blood because it was blood, I don't answer them. Because forgiveness is wasted on a man who sends poison to his own father's door. What I do regret is smaller. I regret that he mistook my patience for something else. That he thought silence meant weakness. That he believed betrayal could live forever without consequence. Those regrets aren't about me. They're about him. Because in the end, he chose to be the architect of his own ruin. I just gave the truth enough room to breathe. The house is quiet now. The bottle is gone. The notebook sits closed in a drawer, its pages yellowing with time. The recorder is silent, too. I don't need them anymore. The story has already been told, and the man who wrote himself into it is no longer free to walk this earth as he pleases. Do I miss him? No. You can't miss what was never truly yours. Blood may bind, but loyalty is what holds. And when loyalty dies, blood is nothing more than red water. I drink my coffee in the mornings. I water the plants out front. I nod to the neighbors when they pass. My life is quiet again, peaceful. The kind of quiet I once thought was ordinary. But it isn't ordinary anymore. It's something sharper, stronger, a reminder. Because now I know what silence can do. I know the power of patience when it's sharpened into a blade. And I know that sometimes the deadliest thing you can do to a man is let him talk long enough to bury himself. So, if there's one thing left to say, it's this. They thought silence was emptiness, but silence was the weapon. They thought poison would end me. But poison circled back to its maker. And in the end, revenge didn't roar. It whispered. And that whisper was enough to end him. They thought poison would end me. But poison has a way of circling back to its maker. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to strike with anger. I only needed patience. And patience was the sharpest weapon I ever carried.